Alright, welcome back to another video on Resident Evil. And in this video I want to talk about, can Resident Evil 2 top Resident Evil 1 remake? You know, because the original Resident Evil 1 remake is probably by far one of the greatest remakes ever made. I mean, even by today's standards, the GameCube remake still looks amazing if you just want to look at the visual representation of it. But I think it'd be interesting to compare these two remakes once we actually get to play Resident Evil 2, because I think Resident Evil 2 remake has a huge chance to become the next big remake that everyone talks about as the greatest remake by Capcom and the greatest Resident Evil remake. But I don't think it's going to be easy. Visually, yes, Resident Evil 2 remake is going to look better than Resident Evil 1. Even the Resident Evil HD port that we got on the current consoles, it's still going to look better because this is a new engine. This is a new Resident Evil. So it's going to be the most polished. So yeah, graphic wise it's going to look great. But that's a very small factor that doesn't really matter, because 20 years from now we'll look at this game and we'll talk about how it doesn't look as good as Resident Evil 3 when that comes out, because you know 20 years from now that ought to be coming out. But anyways, the other things that you can compare though are things like gameplay. On one hand, you have the original Resident Evil remake, the first one, that kept the fixed camera angles that the 1996 Resident Evil had. So we still kept that same feeling. It had pre-rendered backgrounds still, and it felt like the original Resident Evils did, with the fixed camera angles, the pre-rendered backgrounds, and that gameplay mode. But then it also added things like Crimson Heads. That was a big addition to the original Resident Evil. The remake with the whole Crimson Head was just awesome. You could burn them if you wanted to, but you had to watch out for which ones you burned, because sometimes when you went to go burn them, they'd actually already come up. So you couldn't kill all of them that way, because sometimes they would sneak up on you and it'd just be this whole mess. Crimson Heads were a nice addition to add more terrifying feel, another terrifying feel to it that the original game did not have. Another thing was Lisa Trevor. Lisa Trevor was another addition that the remake added from the original, and she was absolutely terrifying. She had the whole deformed look about her because of all the testing that they did to her. She had the several researchers from Umbrella that she killed. She had their faces stitched to her body. Lisa Trevor was creepy and terrifying looking in the remake, and that was another addition that I really liked. You also had different locations that were added into the remake and things of that nature. So the Resident Evil 1 remake is super iconic. It's a legendary remake, and I think it's going to be very, very hard to top. However, when you look at Resident Evil 2 remake and you play the demo, by just looking at the trailers and playing that demo, it has a very good shot. A couple of things that it changed, of course, are the perspective. We're now over the shoulder. It's no longer fixed camera with pre-rendered backgrounds. It's no longer that. It is now over the shoulder, and so that gameplay element is going to change. I don't think that's going to really factor in too much, because based off the demo, it still seems like it's going to be survival horror. It doesn't feel like we're going the Resident Evil 4 route. It felt like Resident Evil 2 just over the shoulder. So I like that, because we really haven't had an over the shoulder game that was actually like classic Resident Evil of anything like that. We've had over the shoulder that was like Resident Evil 4, where it was action horror, and we've had, because even the Evil Within series, it's more closely intact with Resident Evil 4 style than it is with Resident Evil 1 or 2. But anyways, the camera angle, it's going to be different, but I'm very interested to see, will we have new enemies in this game? I know I read an article a couple months ago or whatever that stated, like not a couple months ago, but like a month ago, I read an article that said that there would not be any new enemies in Resident Evil 2. If that is indeed true, and I don't know if it is, that's unfortunate because that was a huge bonus with the original remake. Having Lisa Trevor, having those Crimson Heads, that's one of the things that was such a great add-on, was you had this new set of enemies in the game that gave it this new fresh take. If Resident Evil Remake doesn't give us that, it's going to be a little flat on that end. Because, yeah, it's going to be great to see zombies again, and Lickers, and Mr. X, and William Birkin, and, you know, the Plant 43, I think is what it was. Like, it's going to be cool to see all these monsters again, but it would also be cool to see something new. Something we haven't seen before. Now, I don't know if that could possibly rule out Crimson Heads or not. I don't know. Perhaps Crimson Heads do make it in this game. I'm not sure. Maybe that's a possibility, but who knows. I just know I would like to see some unique enemy that we've never seen in a Resident Evil game before make an appearance in Resident Evil 2. Give us more G-Virus based enemies, because in the original Resident Evil there was William Birkin. He was the one G-Virus enemy you had, and the G-Virus embryos that he spit out into Chief Brian Irons and Ben the Reporter. Once those things hatched and busted out of them, that was also a G-Virus enemy. So you had like 3 G-Virus enemies throughout the entire series in Resident Evil 2. You didn't really have much else, because Lickers and the zombies were created from the T-Virus. So give us something else that was from the G-Virus. I'm not sure, but that's just something I would like to see, is more unique enemies, not just the same things that we've already seen. Give us some fresh takes and let us have a new experience, something unexpected. I think we will, hopefully, but if not, that's okay. I'm still interested in other things, such as how will things change as far as boss fights, because Resident Evil 2, we see in the demo trailer, that alligator, it looks a whole lot more intense at the end of that trailer. I mean, it's like a second long, but it just, you see Leon, he's in like knee-deep water. The alligator seems a lot more vicious. Just based off of the 1 or 2 seconds that you see the alligator in that trailer, it seems like it's going to be a whole lot more to it than just put a tank in its mouth and shoot the tank and it's dead. Seems like there's going to be a lot more to it. This alligator looked a lot faster than the alligator of Resident Evil 2 original. So I'm thinking boss fights are going to be a lot better in this game than the remake had. And that's just me guessing. I could be off, but I'm pretty sure the boss fights will be better, because I would argue that the original Resident Evil had better boss fights. At least Yawn, the giant snake, was a better boss fight. Because I've said this in my Resident Evil Remake Let's Play, that in the original Resident Evil, you fight Yawn the second time in a room that's just a room. There's nothing there. There's a fireplace and the room that you fight him in. Whereas in the remake, you fight Yawn in a room with a bookshelf that you can run around to take cover. So it made the fight easier. Whereas Remake 2, based off of that few seconds that you see the giant alligator, it seems like it might be a tougher fight, just because he looked like he was moving faster. And there was a lot of water. Whereas in the original, he was slow. He was not a very fast alligator. And there was no water. So those 2 things right there are already 2 things that look like it's going to be a tougher fight. So hopefully it was re-envisioned to a way in which it will be a tougher battle. And so I'm hoping boss fights will be tougher in Remake 2 than what they were in the original remake. But who's to say? Other than that, you know, the camera and the boss fights and the graphics, I mean, we already know the music is going to be good, because it's Resident Evil, and so the soundtracks are always great, but the deluxe version is going to have the original soundtrack to it if you want to use it, which I'm going to use just because I love that soundtrack. The Resident Evil 2 soundtrack is my favorite soundtrack in Resident Evil. Resident Evil 1 is a very close second, but Resident Evil 2 has the best soundtrack in my opinion. Resident Evil 3 has some very good ones. I think the soundtracks are at their strongest once you get past 4. I think that's when the soundtracks start to die. They're not as good, they're not as iconic, but I think Resident Evil 2 is going to have a very good soundtrack. Its soundtrack. Now, like I said, the deluxe version will have the original soundtrack, but I'm still curious to see what this version will be. What will the remake soundtrack sound like? Because if you listen to Resident Evil 1 remake, it has an amazing soundtrack. So it's going to be interesting to compare the soundtracks and see which one has the better original soundtrack. Although Resident Evil Remake used a lot of the soundtrack from the original game, it just brought those back. Like, for example, if you listen to the Guardhouse 1, that is in the original 1996 Resident Evil. So there are plenty of soundtracks within Remake 1 that were in the 1996 Resident Evil. So there was a lot of recycling. I don't know if Resident Evil 2 will do that necessarily, but there was a lot of recycling. But I think the soundtracks will be pretty interesting. I'm really looking forward to seeing how it will fully compare to Resident Evil 1 Remake. And another thing, and kind of the obvious thing, I don't know how I haven't mentioned it yet, 12 minutes into the video, is which one's going to be scarier? Because Resident Evil 1, when it first came out and we never knew anything about it, was a pretty scary game. I mean, you had the Crimson Heads, which was a completely new curveball that got thrown at everybody. Nobody was expecting that. You just walking around, all of a sudden that zombie you killed comes back up faster than it was before, making these creepy noises. Lisa Trevor, like I said, way darker. The game is way darker in the atmosphere than the original. The original was kind of bright compared to Remake. So Resident Evil Remake was a pretty scary game, and it also used jump scares very clever. For example, in the original 1996 Resident Evil, you go down that main hall and the glass breaks and the dogs come chasing after you. In Remake, it teases you and it has the glass chip. The dogs don't come out until you come back out the other way. Then the dogs come. This works two ways. This is how good this jump scare is. First, when the glass chips, it startles you because you think, oh crap, the dogs are coming. But it doesn't happen. Then, it causes you to let your guard down because now you think that's the jump scare. A chipped piece of glass, but no, it's not. You walk out the other way and the dogs actually come out. So now you're unprepared for it. So the jump scares were really good and executed well in Remake. Now, we've played the game so much now that we've gotten used to most of the jump scares. There are the occasional jump scares in Remake that can still get you here and there because you forgot about them. But I think Resident Evil 2 might be scarier based off the visuals. The zombies move so much faster, and these are just based zombies. I mean, imagine if Crimson Head's going to show up in this game. I mean, there's no confirmation or anything that there will be Crimson Heads, but just imagine if there are. That's going to be intense. Now, this game is a lot darker than Remake. You're carrying around a flashlight. It's so dark. And you have one little concentrated beam of light compared to Remake 1. So, I think this game has a lot more potential to be scarier than what the original was, or the first Remake. But that's not a guarantee exactly yet. Now, it does also have another advantage to be scary, and that's called Mr. X. Mr. X is a relentless tyrant that will continue to chase Leon and Claire around, now that the A/B scenarios are fused together. And even William Birkin. Resident Evil 1 didn't have that. You had a tyrant that showed up at the very end of the game, so you never had that big fear factor. Your biggest fear factor of that game was Crimson Heads and Hunters later on. Now you're going to have a big tyrant coming at you. So I think Resident Evil 2 Remake will be scarier than Resident Evil 1 Remake when all is said and done. And that's a great thing, because the scarier the game, the better. That's why I buy these games, is because I like the scary factor. That's why I loved it. Even though I love Resident Evil 6, it's not scary. There's nothing remotely scary about it. And I like Resident Evil scary. I don't like cheap jump scare scary like 7. 7 was a Slender Man effect to it. And it became not scary because it was just too reliant on jump scares and nothing else. Resident Evil 2 Remake looks like it's going to have a whole factor of things, from jump scares to the music to the atmosphere to just everything. Feels like it's going to be really good. And I think this game is going to be scarier than the first remake. Now, another thing that will be interesting is characters and how they change those characters. I think this game is going to do better than the original remake with their characters. In the original remake, it was just kind of, they took the original 1996 Resident Evil and they did it over again. Just repolished it really nice with modern graphics and added a couple new things here and there. But as far as the characters, they followed basically the same path. Whereas in this game, Resident Evil 2 Remake, it looks like there's going to be a whole lot more character depth to the minor characters from the original. In other words, Marvin, the police officer, looks like he's going to have a much bigger role than he did in the original. In the original, he talks to Leon or Claire, whoever you play as, for just a moment. Puts a gun up to him and tells him to go find the other survivors. And then you leave and that's it. Next time you see him, he turns into a zombie. This one, just in the trailer, he already has more development. Who knows what all he does before he dies. So that's just one example. I'm pretty sure Chief Brian Irons, the insane psycho cop of the police of chief, or the chief of police, I'm positive he's going to have a lot more character development too, based on the fact that it seems in the trailer he kidnaps Sherry. He didn't do that in the original. And I'm also curious, will the mayor's daughter have anything to do with the game, or is she just going to be a dead body to begin with? Or will we actually get to see her when she's alive and well before she dies? I think the characters are going to be a lot more fleshed out in this game than when they were in Resident Evil 1 Remake. I think the first remake was good, but it didn't really do much for the characters. The characters were still the same as they were from 1996. I think Resident Evil 2 Remake is going to do a lot more with their characters. They're going to be a lot more fleshed out, going to have a lot more depth to them, and I think they're going to last longer too. I think, is it Kano or whatever, the gun shop owner? I think he's going to have a bigger role. I don't think it's going to be that one scene and then, oh, the glass breaks and he gets eaten alive. I think he's going to play a bigger part. And this was the original concept for these characters back in 1998 when Resident Evil 2 was being made. It's just these concepts got cut short and all these characters got killed off quickly. So I think the characters are going to be a lot more fleshed out. So I think boss fights have a better potential. I think the fear factor has a much better potential because of Mr. X. And I think the characters are going to be a lot more fleshed out in this game than they were for Resident Evil 1 Remake characters. So all in all, I think this game is going to surpass the original Resident Evil. Now there is one factor to put in mind, and that is we have grown attached to the original Resident Evil 1 Remake for, what is it, 15, 16, 17 years now? Like, it's been a while since that GameCube remake came out. That was like 2001, 2002. So we have a very strong nostalgic attachment to that game. So it's very likely that Resident Evil 2 Remake could be the better remake, but that our bias and our nostalgic thoughts will keep us from saying that, and we'll still say that, oh, the original Resident Evil remake is better. But that's just one, that is one way that I could still see Resident Evil 1 remake being better. But I think all in all, Resident Evil 2 remake will probably, when all things are said and done, be the new definitive remake that people talk about. That's just my opinion. I could be wrong. Maybe Resident Evil 1 remake still lives to be the king of remakes for Capcom. I just don't think so. I think as time goes on and new things are discovered with technology, it's just a matter of time before a new remake comes along, and I think that's this time. I mean, just look at the detail this thing has. It's insane. So as much as I love the first remake, I don't think it's going to be the top dog anymore. And my next video that I'll probably possibly do, I'm not sure yet, is talk about, can Resident Evil 2 remake top Resident Evil 4? Because we know how big of an empire that thing is, being Resident Evil 4, and it's the Resident Evil that everybody talks about as the greatest Resident Evil of all time. It's the perfect Resident Evil. No Resident Evil is better than it because it's Resident Evil 4. I think it's interesting also to think about, could Resident Evil 2 remake surpass even that as a large fan base? Now for me, Resident Evil 4 falls at like number 3, maybe 4, but I think it is interesting to see where Resident Evil 2 remake will stand in the hierarchy of all the Resident Evil games, and what its final ranking will be amongst them. That's the end of this video for me. I want to end it here, and I will see you all in the next one. See you then.